So the story of Jesus cleansing the temple has become one of my favorite Jesus stories in the Gospels. And I think it's because it is so different than our cultural understanding or our cultural projection of Jesus as being, like baby Jesus in the manger who's meek and mild. We have this understanding of Jesus as always just being nice, and that the gospel is about us being nice and us never making a fuss or never challenging anything. And so when we read the story of Jesus cleansing the temple and we see Jesus get mad and braid a cord of whips and drive out the animals and flip over the tables in order to stop this practice that he's seeing, that is a door for us into understanding why the gospel brings us into conflict. Why the gospel is not about being nice, why the gospel is about a transformative and radical love, and why, because the gospel is not just about being nice, we need a better definition of sin too. I think for many of us, we have probably always been taught that sin is bad stuff you do. That's our cultural understanding of sin, that it is about individual bad actions. That sin is when you mess up. But this thing Jesus does seems like it could be a sin until we start understanding it as not about that Jesus just gets angry, but that we understand the way this story is a door into the Gospels and how disruptive being a Christ follower, living a life of radical love actually is to systems, actually is to things that are truly sinful, that take us away from union and the love of God. Now, as a lifelong United Methodist, I have not heard a lot of sermons or preached a lot of sermons specifically about sin. And so I want to give you what my working definition of sin is, since I think this story helps us have a better understanding of how we as religious people need to be thinking about this. So for me, I understand sin as anything that's going to take us farther away from God, that's going to interrupt that union with God that we're being called into, that relationship that God desires with us, that is intimate and close and that consumes us. So yeah, that can be things you do. Of course it can. But that's not all it can be. It can be things that are done to you that cause you to lose your sense of belovedness. It can be lies you're told about yourself. It can also be systems that exploit. It can be systems that oppress. It can be ways that we misuse the abundance of God's creation to make some people feel like they don't matter, like they don't deserve to eat, don't deserve a place to lay their head at night, that they're not beloved. So all of these things need to inform our understanding of what sin is, so that we can see how Jesus' actions in the temple are leading us into a deeper understanding and a deeper examination of how we are part, maybe unknowingly, of sin, and how we need to question it and how we need to turn over tables in the things we are a part of. Now, there are some points we need to get into in this passage in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is turning over tables. He's cleansing the temple in chapter 2. Now, this passage, this story, appears in all four Gospels. But in the synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it happens at the end. It happens during our celebration of Holy Week. It's after Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem. It's his final few days there, and he really is making people very angry. There's a lot of conflict there. He is like peak commentary on the system. He is peak being this prophetic witness. And it ends up, of course, leading into the Passion, and that we know that we will read in a few weeks during Holy Week. But in John, it's in chapter 2. It's at the very beginning. We have the Word was God and the Word was with God in chapter 1. Then we have the wedding at Cana at the beginning of chapter 2. And then Jesus is cleansing the temple. And so it can't be this peak of the narrative. It can't be this high point of conflict. It's something else. And I think that because of its relationship to the wedding at Cana, I think this is providing us some commentary on religious systems. Now, we need to understand, so that we can avoid inadvertent anti Semitism, that this is not a passage that is saying that Judaism is bad, or that Judaism is sinful, or that Judaism is wrong. It's not about that. This is internal commentary in its own context. And so we need to read it as commentary for us as religious people. We need to understand how it has meaning for us. It has a historical context in its time, but it also, because it is Holy Scripture, is speaking and leading us into examination of how we are practicing religion. So the wedding at Cana that happens just before this, you have Jesus performing a miracle that's all about God's abundance. And then he shows up at the temple, and there's this economy that is built up in order to facilitate people having this religious experience that connects them with God. Now, this is not commentary on that this practice has just like gotten off track and so it needs reform. This is commentary that the temple itself, that requires this of people, that requires the buying and the selling and the changing of money, is itself a barrier, is itself contrary and in contrast to this way that Jesus has shown God's abundance and God's love poured out like wine at the wedding at Cana. So this story is a commentary on religion that creates barriers, religion that erects walls to people having a deeper understanding of God. It's a commentary on religion that separates people from God. It's a commentary on religious practice that has fallen itself into sin. And again, that is not a commentary on Judaism as a whole. It's a commentary on this particular cultic practice in this time, and how we can read that as commentary on what we do or do not do. The other thing we need to know about this is Jesus says, well, the temple is going to be torn down and built up in 3 days. And yes, there is this image of the resurrection that is read into that, but also when people would have been reading this Gospel of John originally, when it was finally written down, that was after the Jerusalem temple was already destroyed. And so there's an element of providing some retroactive commentary, some retrospection for the hearers of this gospel, these Jesus cult followers at the time, to think about religious practice that they may have been involved in, to think about religious practice that they perhaps are even mourning, or that has caused some upheaval in their community because there is this huge change of the temple being destroyed. There is this desolation, this devastation of the loss of the Jerusalem temple and all of the religious practice and custom and tradition and comfort that went along with it. And so the people hearing this are perhaps hearing that, this thing is gone. But is that bad? Is that okay for us? Or how do we really feel about the loss of this temple and the practices that went along with it? Now, for us in 2021 as Christians, we need to be very aware that for my entire lifetime, probably for most of your entire lifetimes, for as long as anybody has been tracking it, all of the metrics have shown that the institutional church is in decline, that that the church is dying, as people will often say. And many individual churches, if not most individual churches, are themselves facing difficult decisions about how to keep buildings operating, how to keep ministries operating, how to keep staff on. And COVID, of course, has just compounded that for so many people. And I wonder, with that in mind, with that being the reality of Christianity, at least in America, if not beyond that, if not that also in Western Europe, with our Western white Christendom, with that in mind, how do we reflect on it in light of Jesus cleansing the temple? If those churches had been really married to the barriers that they have erected, maybe if they were churches that created and built walls that prevented people from having full access to their own belovedness, to God's love for them, maybe that decline is not a bad thing. So many churches and so many parts of our Christian system, of our Christian institution in America, of the American church, of the white American church especially, have been married to systems of power that did create barriers. If we look back at our own history as Methodists over and over and over again, the institutional church has chosen to side with power at the exclusion, at the direct exclusion, and at injustice directed towards marginalized communities, whether that was African Americans or women or currently LGBTQ folks. The church, the American church, has been so wedded to racism and white supremacy, to sexism and misogyny, to homophobia and heteronormativity, to abuses of creation, to capitalism and classism, that maybe it's time for us to reflect on the barriers we've created, and if the tables that we have set up within God's temple actually need to be flipped over. Maybe Christ is cleansing our temple here in 21st century America. And how do we, as Christians who are becoming aware of that, who have a better definition of sin that we do not weaponize against people, but that we understand is about the separation of ourselves and others from God, intentionally or unintentionally? How do we not be part of those systems anymore? How do we tear down barriers? How do we take down walls so that other people can know their belovedness, so that people come and sit around a table instead of being asked if they're really worthy or not? What is our standard for being a temple that's already been cleansed? The Apostle Paul says that the wisdom of the cross is foolishness to the world. And he goes on to talk about sort of this inverse relationship that is the theme of our whole sermon series during this season of Lent. And Paul also says that the wisdom that we proclaim as Christians is not the wisdom of the world. It's not the wisdom of anything other than Christ crucified. And so I think the way we make sure that we're not the tables that need to get flipped, the way we make sure that we're not inadvertently creating barriers to others having access to the love of God and instead are inviting them into relationship, I think we do that by always leaving power behind. All of these systems that we get married to are about our own position. They're about our own authority. They're about us having a place of security and centrality. They're about us being comfortable in a way and knowing from outside sources that we matter. But I think the way that we're called to, the crucified way, is actually about us always leaving those things behind. It's about us always moving downward to the ones who have nothing to offer, who have no authority to grant us, who have no comfort to give us momentarily. And instead, loving sacrificially and always being willing to give up more and more and more of all of those worldly systems that promised power and prestige, but only delivered sin. We check ourselves by making sure that by the world's standards, that we appear as fools, that we appear that we've lost our minds in our level of generosity and love for the ones that we're not supposed to love, the ones we're not supposed to welcome. And we make foolish choices intentionally about a love that is so abundant that it not only pours out wine at a wedding, but goes all the way to the cross and is willing to be crucified rather than betray that love. And so this is your homework with that in mind. I want you to think about, how have you in the past loved foolishly? How have you practiced this? How have you been a fool to the world because you proclaimed Christ crucified with your life? And what are ways that you're not ready to love foolishly yet? What are the barriers that are holding you back from that foolish love, from those foolish choices that take down barriers, that allow systems that have only brought pain, that have brought sin, that have brought exclusion, that allows them to pass away? Because instead, it proclaims the love of God that we know through Jesus Christ.